You're standing in the shadows of the Hippodrome in Constantinople. The year is 1025 AD, and you witness something that will make your blood run cold. The most powerful man in the world, Emperor Basil II, is walking through his private gardens accompanied by a procession that defies everything you thought you knew about Byzantine court life. Behind him follow dozens of young men, each more beautiful than the last, their silk garments catching the morning light as they move with practiced grace through corridors. Forbidden to all but the emperor's most intimate circle, these aren't ordinary courtiers or palace guards. These are members of what history has tried desperately to forget. The emperor's personal collection of male companions, handpicked for their beauty and kept in conditions of luxury that rivaled the treatment of empresses themselves. What you're witnessing is one of the most carefully guarded secrets of the Byzantine Empire, a tradition so scandalous that chroniclers erased it from official records, leaving only whispered rumors and coded references in private letters. Before diving into these forgotten stories of power and obsession, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of imperial excess. It's the story of how absolute power created systems of exploitation so elaborate and systematic that they operated for centuries while remaining virtually invisible to history. The male harems of Byzantine emperors weren't accidents or aberrations. They were institutions, carefully managed and jealously guarded, that served purposes far beyond mere pleasure. Let's start with the empire itself. Byzantium wasn't Rome, though it claimed that legacy. It was something far more complex, a fusion of Roman administrative genius, Greek intellectual tradition, and Christian moral authority that created a civilization unlike anything the world had ever seen. At its height, the Byzantine Empire stretched from Italy to the Caucasus, controlling trade routes that connected Europe to Asia and commanding wealth that made medieval kings look like paupers. But this wasn't the Byzantium of textbooks, with its theological debates and military campaigns. This was the Byzantium of the Sacred Palace, where power operated according to rules that would have shocked even the most jaded Roman senator. The palace complex in Constantinople wasn't just a residence. It was a city within a city, containing thousands of rooms, gardens that spanned acres, and a population of servants, officials, and hangers-on that numbered in the tens of thousands. Within this labyrinth of marble corridors and golden chambers existed spaces that few outsiders ever glimpsed. The most secretive of these was the koiton, theoretically the emperor's private bedchamber, but actually a complex of interconnected rooms where the ruler conducted his most intimate business. It was here, behind doors guarded by eunuchs sworn to absolute secrecy, that the male harems flourished. The system began, like so many imperial traditions, as a practical solution to a political problem. Byzantine emperors lived in constant fear of assassination, betrayal, and palace coups. Traditional marriage alliances created powerful in-laws who might challenge imperial authority. Female concubines could bear children who would complicate succession, but young men, carefully selected and completely dependent on imperial favor, offered companionship without political risk. At least, that was the theory. The reality was far more complex and infinitely more disturbing. The recruitment process for the imperial male harem began in the furthest reaches of the empire, where talent scouts, operating under various official pretenses, searched for boys who met very specific criteria. They needed to be between the ages of 12 and 16, possessed of exceptional physical beauty, and crucially, completely without family connections that might protect them or seek revenge for their disappearance. These scouts weren't looking for volunteers. They were hunting for victims. The selection process was refined over centuries into a grotesque art form. Provincial governors received coded instructions about the type of gifts that would be most appreciated by their imperial master. Tribute lists from conquered territories included not just gold and silk, but human cargo described in terms that left no doubt about their intended purpose. Young men who caught the wrong person's attention simply vanished from their communities. Their families told they had been chosen for imperial service, an honor that no one dared question. Picture the journey of one such boy. Let's call him Mikhail, though that wasn't his original name. He was 15 when the imperial agents arrived in his mountain village, ostensibly collecting taxes, but actually evaluating the local population for other purposes. Mikhail was the son of a blacksmith, blessed with the kind of ethereal beauty that seemed to glow in the mountain air. His dark eyes held depths that spoke of intelligence, while his lean frame suggested the strength that came from honest work. The agents noticed him immediately. Within a week, Mikhail found himself chained in a wagon bound for Constantinople, told that he had been selected for special training in imperial service. The journey took months, during which he was kept with other boys of similar age and appearance. They were fed well, bathed regularly, and given clean clothes, not out of kindness, but because damaged goods were worth less at their destination. The boys traveled through landscapes that grew progressively more magnificent as they approached the capital. Rolling hills gave way to fertile valleys, then to cities whose size defied imagination. Finally, they reached Constantinople itself, a metropolis that seemed to float between Europe and Asia, its domes and spires reaching toward heaven, while its harbors teemed with ships from every corner of the known world. But Michael saw none of this splendor. He was processed through the palace like cargo, subjected to medical examinations that stripped away any remaining dignity, cataloged according to physical attributes, and assigned a new identity that erased his previous existence. The boy who had once been a blacksmith's son in a mountain village ceased to exist. In his place stood imperial property, valuable enough to be housed in luxury, but human enough to understand exactly what he had lost. The training that followed was unlike anything these boys could have imagined. They were taught to walk, speak, and move in ways that emphasized their beauty while minimizing any trace of masculine assertiveness. Voice coaches worked with them to develop speaking patterns that were melodious and submissive. Dancing masters taught them to move their bodies in ways designed to please imperial eyes. Scholars instructed them in poetry, music, and conversation, not to make them educated, but to make them more interesting diversions. But perhaps most importantly, they were taught absolute obedience through a combination of rewards and punishments that broke down their sense of individual will. Boys who complied quickly received better food, warmer clothing, and privileges that seemed generous by the standards of their imprisonment. Those who resisted faced isolation, hunger, and physical punishments that left no visible marks but created lasting trauma. The psychological conditioning was systematic and relentless. The boys learned that their survival depended entirely on pleasing their captors, that any attempt to resist would result in suffering not just for themselves, but for other boys who shared their fate. They developed a form of learned helplessness that made rebellion literally unthinkable, replacing their original personalities with carefully constructed facades designed to appeal to imperial tastes. Within the palace, these young men existed in a state of luxurious captivity that confused outside observers who glimpsed them. They wore silk robes that cost more than most families earned in a year. They ate food prepared by the finest chefs in the empire. They lived in chambers decorated with artwork that represented the pinnacle of Byzantine artistic achievement. To casual observers, they appeared to be among the most privileged people in the empire. The reality was that they were the most expensive slaves in the world, their every comfort designed not for their benefit, but to enhance their value as imperial possessions. Their silk robes were chains made of fabric. Their sumptuous meals were bait in an elaborate trap. Their beautiful chambers were cells in the most sophisticated prison ever constructed. The emperors who maintained these harems weren't monsters in the conventional sense. They were products of a system that had evolved over centuries to concentrate absolute power in the hands of single individuals while providing those individuals with every possible luxury and indulgence. They genuinely believed that their desires, no matter how extreme, were justified by their divine appointment to rule. The boys in their harems weren't people to be considered. They were resources to be consumed. The daily routine within the imperial male harem followed patterns that had been refined through generations of practice. Each morning began before dawn, when the young men were awakened by eunuch overseers who inspected them like prize horses being prepared for display. Their skin was examined for blemishes, their hair arranged in styles that had been specifically chosen to enhance their individual features, and their bodies anointed with oils imported from the far reaches of the empire. These weren't random beauty treatments. They were calculated preparations for potential imperial summons. Each boy's appearance was documented in detailed records that noted their physical attributes, personality traits, and the emperor's previous reactions to their presence. The eunuch administrators maintained these files with the precision of military strategists, because in many ways, that's exactly what they were. The hierarchy within the harem was complex and constantly shifting, based on the emperor's current preferences and the boys' ability to maintain their positions of favor. At the top were the chosen ones, typically 3 or 4 young men who had achieved something approaching permanent status in the emperor's affections. These favorites enjoyed privileges that included private chambers, personal servants, and the right to speak directly to the emperor without formal permission. Below them were the hopefuls, newer additions to the collection who were still being evaluated for their potential. These boys lived in shared quarters and competed desperately for any sign of imperial attention, understanding that their very survival might depend on catching the emperor's eye at the right moment. Their training intensified during this probationary period, with masters teaching them everything from advanced conversation techniques to specialized skills that might distinguish them from their rivals. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the forgotten, boys who had once held favor but had fallen from grace, either through aging, injury, or simply failing to maintain the emperor's interest. These unfortunate souls existed in a twilight state, neither released from service nor actively utilized, serving primarily as cautionary examples to the others about the consequences of losing imperial approval. The psychological dynamics within this environment were extraordinarily complex. The boys developed intricate relationships with each other that combined genuine affection with calculated competition. Friendships formed under the pressure of shared trauma, but could be shattered instantly by the possibility of imperial favor. Some formed protective alliances, sharing information about the emperor's moods and preferences. Others became ruthless competitors, willing to sabotage their companions for the slightest advantage. Emperor Constantine VII, who ruled in the mid-10th century, was particularly notorious for the elaborate games he created within his male harem. He would pit favorites against each other in contests of wit, beauty, and skill, rewarding winners with luxuries while punishing losers with temporary banishment from his presence. These competitions weren't just entertainment. They were sophisticated psychological torture that kept the young men in a constant state of anxiety and dependence. The emperor's chamber became the center of this twisted universe, a space where the most powerful man in the civilized world could indulge fantasies that would have been impossible anywhere else. The room itself was a masterpiece of Byzantine artistry, with walls covered in mosaics depicting mythological scenes and floors inlaid with precious stones that formed intricate patterns. But beneath this beauty lay an atmosphere of fear and desperation that no amount of artistic magnificence could disguise. When summoned to these private audiences, the young men never knew what to expect. Sometimes the emperor wanted nothing more than conversation, seeking relief from the burdens of governance through discussions about poetry or philosophy with companions who posed no political threat. Other times, his desires were more physical, expressed through demands that left his favorites traumatized, but afraid to show any sign of distress. The most disturbing aspect of these encounters was their unpredictability. An emperor might shower a boy with gifts and affection one day, then order him beaten for some imagined slight the next. This emotional whiplash was intentional, designed to create complete psychological dependence by making the young men constantly seek approval while never feeling secure in their positions. The eunuch administrators who managed the harem were themselves products of the same system, having survived similar ordeals in their own youth before rising to positions of relative authority. Their knowledge of imperial preferences was encyclopedic, accumulated through years of careful observation and bitter experience. They understood exactly which boys would appeal to their master's current moods and how to present them in ways that maximized their chances of survival. These administrators kept detailed schedules of imperial encounters, noting which companions were summoned, for how long, and in what condition they returned. This information wasn't just administrative record-keeping. It was intelligence gathering that could mean the difference between life and death for the boys under their care. They learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when an emperor was growing bored with a particular favorite, allowing them to gradually shift that boy away from active service before imperial displeasure could turn violent. The economic aspects of the harem were staggering in their scope and complexity. The cost of maintaining dozens of young men in luxury exceeded the annual revenues of entire provinces. Their clothing alone represented a fortune. Each silk robe was individually tailored by master craftsmen, often incorporating gold thread and precious stones. Their meals were prepared by teams of specialized chefs who understood exactly how to present food in ways that enhanced the boys' natural beauty. Even their education represented a massive investment. The palace employed teachers who specialized in training young men for imperial service, masters of subjects ranging from classical literature to intimate arts that cannot be described in polite society. These instructors were paid salaries that made them wealthy by any standard, compensation for their discretion as much as their expertise. But the most expensive aspect of the system wasn't the luxury, it was the security. Maintaining absolute secrecy about the harem's existence required extensive networks of spies, informants, and enforcers who ensured that knowledge of imperial preferences never reached hostile ears. Foreign ambassadors who glimpsed too much during palace visits sometimes simply disappeared. Servants who overheard conversations they shouldn't have witnessed were transferred to distant postings from which they never returned. The boys themselves were constantly monitored by guards whose loyalty had been purchased through combinations of wealth and terror. These men understood that their own lives depended on preventing any of their charges from escaping or communicating with the outside world. They developed sophisticated techniques for psychological control that kept the young men compliant without visible coercion, methods that were passed down through generations of imperial service. As years passed within this gilded prison, the psychological toll on the inhabitants became increasingly evident. Many developed what palace physicians euphemistically called melancholy of the spirit, a condition that modern understanding would recognize as severe depression and trauma. Some boys retreated so deeply into themselves that they became like living statues, beautiful but essentially absent from their own lives. Others developed more active forms of mental disturbance, creating elaborate fantasy worlds where they imagined themselves as powerful figures rather than powerless victims. These delusions sometimes became so convincing that the boys began to believe their own fabrications, leading to behavior that put them at risk of imperial displeasure when reality inevitably intruded on their psychological refugees. The most tragic cases were those who genuinely began to love their captors, developing Stockholm Syndrome so severe that they competed desperately for scraps of imperial affection, while convincing themselves that their situation represented a privilege rather than a curse. These boys became the most effective tools of the system, helping to train newcomers and enforce discipline among their companions, while never understanding that they were participating in their own continued victimization. The most heartbreaking aspect of this psychological destruction was watching boys who had once possessed vibrant personalities slowly transform into hollow echoes of themselves. Michael, the blacksmith's son whose journey we followed from his mountain village, exemplified this tragic metamorphosis. Within 2 years of his arrival at the palace, the intelligent young man who had once crafted iron with his father's hands had become something else entirely, a carefully programmed automaton whose every gesture was calculated to please imperial eyes. His transformation wasn't sudden or dramatic. Instead, it occurred through thousands of tiny compromises, each one seeming reasonable at the time, but collectively erasing everything that had made him unique. The first compromise was learning to answer to his new name, Callistos, meaning most beautiful in Greek. The palace administrators explained that his birth name was too provincial for imperial service, that Callistos better reflected his elevated status within the court hierarchy. Next came the alterations to his speech patterns. His natural mountain accent, which had carried the musical cadences of his homeland, was systematically replaced with the refined pronunciation favored by Constantinople's elite. Voice coaches worked with him daily, correcting every syllable until his words carried no trace of his origins. They told him this was an honor, that he was being taught to speak like nobility rather than a peasant. His posture changed next. The confident stance of a young man accustomed to physical labor was replaced with something more graceful, but infinitely more submissive. Dancing masters taught him to move with fluid elegance, to position his hands in ways that appeared natural, but had been carefully choreographed to emphasize his beauty. They explained that this training would make him more appealing to the emperor, that mastering these skills could elevate his position within the harem hierarchy. Each lesson chipped away at another piece of his original identity, until Michael the blacksmith's son existed only in the deepest recesses of memory, buried beneath layers of imperial conditioning that made accessing those memories increasingly painful. The boy who had once taken pride in creating useful objects with his hands now spent hours learning to arrange his body like a work of art, valuable only for its aesthetic appeal to a single viewer. The other boys in the harem recognized what was happening to Mikhail because they had experienced identical transformations themselves. They watched with a mixture of sympathy and relief. Sympathy because they understood his pain, relief because his successful conditioning meant their own compliance was working correctly. In this environment, successful adaptation to captivity became a form of survival that required celebrating the destruction of one's authentic self. The eunuch overseers particularly prized boys like Mikhail, who adapted quickly to their new circumstances. They were held up as examples to newcomers, proof that imperial service could be not just bearable, but rewarding for those wise enough to embrace their destiny. These success stories became part of the harem's internal mythology, tales of boys who had risen from humble origins to positions of influence within the most powerful court in the world. But influence within the harem was a carefully constructed illusion. Even the highest-ranking favorites possessed no real power beyond their ability to please the emperor. Their influence extended only as far as his current mood, evaporating instantly if they fell from grace. They lived in constant awareness that their privileged position could be revoked without warning or explanation, that yesterday's favorite could become tomorrow's forgotten casualty. Emperor John Tzimiskes, who ruled in the late 10th century, demonstrated this reality with particular cruelty during what became known as the Night of Broken Promises. 3 of his longtime favorites had grown confident in their positions, beginning to make small requests for privileges that went beyond the strictly defined boundaries of their roles. One asked permission to correspond with family members from his homeland. Another requested access to books that weren't part of the approved curriculum. The third simply asked to spend an afternoon in the palace gardens without supervision. Tzimiskes interpreted these modest requests as evidence of dangerous independence, signs that his carefully trained companions were developing thoughts and desires beyond their assigned functions. His response was swift and devastating. All three boys were stripped of their privileges, moved to the lowest tier of the hierarchy, and subjected to punishments designed to remind them, and everyone else, exactly what their position meant within the imperial system. The psychological impact of this demonstration extended far beyond the three boys directly affected. Every member of the harem understood that their emperor's affection was conditional and temporary, that even years of perfect service could be erased by a moment's perceived insubordination. This knowledge created an atmosphere of perpetual anxiety that prevented genuine relationships from forming and kept everyone focused solely on maintaining their precarious positions. The isolation these young men experienced was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their captivity. They were surrounded by dozens of others in similar circumstances, yet meaningful connections remained impossible because everyone understood that friendships could be weaponized by the administration. Boys who grew too close might find themselves separated without warning. Those who shared too many confidences might discover that their private conversations had been reported to the eunuch overseers. This enforced emotional isolation served multiple purposes within the harem's management structure. It prevented the formation of alliances that might pose security risks. It kept the boys focused on competing for imperial attention rather than supporting each other. Most importantly, it ensured that their only source of meaningful human connection remained the emperor himself, intensifying their psychological dependence on his approval. The daily routines within the harem reinforced this isolation through carefully designed activities that appeared social but actually prevented genuine intimacy. Group meals were conducted in formal silence. Exercise periods were supervised by guards who reported any conversations that strayed beyond approved topics. Even recreational activities like music or poetry were structured as competitions rather than collaborative endeavors. The boys learned to communicate through subtle gestures and coded glances that wouldn't attract official attention. They developed an elaborate silent language that allowed them to share warnings about dangerous moods or offer comfort during particularly difficult periods. But even these covert communications carried risks, as the eunuch administrators were experts at reading nonverbal cues and punishing unauthorized interactions. Religious observance provided one of the few spaces where genuine human connection remained possible, though even this was heavily monitored and controlled. The palace chapel where the boys attended mandatory services became a place where they could share moments of authentic emotion while ostensibly focused on prayer. The hymns they sang together created brief intervals when their voices could blend in harmony without triggering suspicion from their overseers. Some boys found solace in these religious moments, convincing themselves that their suffering served some divine purpose, or that their prayers might eventually lead to liberation. Others used the rituals as psychological refuge, retreating into meditation that temporarily separated their consciousness from their physical circumstances. But for many, even religious observance became another source of torment as they struggled to reconcile their faith with their reality. The theological questions raised by their situation were profound and unanswerable. If God was just and merciful, why did such systems exist? If the emperor truly ruled by divine appointment, did that make their suffering part of some cosmic plan? These questions had no satisfactory answers, leaving the boys to either abandon their faith or develop increasingly complex rationalizations that allowed them to maintain belief despite overwhelming evidence of divine indifference to their plight. The seasonal rhythms of palace life created additional psychological challenges for the harem's inhabitants. Winter months brought increased confinement as imperial social activities moved indoors, creating more opportunities for private summons, but also more intense scrutiny from administrators. The boys learned to dread the long nights when boredom might lead the emperor to seek diversions that tested the limits of their endurance. Spring arrivals of new tribute from distant provinces always brought fresh competition and reminders of their own diminishing novelty. Each new group of boys represented both potential allies and definite threats to established hierarchies within the harem. Veterans learned to evaluate newcomers with calculating eyes, assessing their likely impact on the delicate balance of imperial preferences. Summer brought the possibility of traveling with the imperial court to various palaces and hunting lodges throughout the empire. These journeys offered brief glimpses of the outside world, but also created new vulnerabilities as the boys were exposed to unfamiliar environments where established routines provided less protection. The logistics of maintaining harem security during travel required elaborate precautions that reminded everyone involved of the illegal nature of their situation. Autumn marked the return to Constantinople and the resumption of formal court activities that might require the boys' presence at state functions. These appearances demanded the highest levels of performance as they were expected to embody imperial magnificence while remaining completely invisible as individuals. The psychological strain of being simultaneously displayed and erased often proved overwhelming for those still struggling to adapt to their circumstances. The economic machinery that sustained the harem operated with ruthless efficiency, consuming resources that could have supported entire cities while producing nothing of tangible value beyond imperial satisfaction. Detailed accounting records, preserved in palace archives, reveal expenditures that boggle the imagination. Thousands of gold pieces spent annually on cosmetics alone. Fortunes invested in clothing that might be worn only once. Massive salaries paid to specialists whose only job was maintaining the boys' physical perfection. These financial records also illuminate the cold calculations that determined each boy's fate within the system. Their value was assessed and reassessed constantly, tracked through metrics that reduced human beings to commodity prices. Boys whose appeal was declining found their resource allocations reduced accordingly, receiving clear signals about their diminishing status within the imperial hierarchy. The most chilling aspect of these documents is their bureaucratic normalcy. Purchases of human beings are recorded with the same mundane precision used for acquiring livestock or household goods. The administrators who maintained these records saw nothing unusual about cataloging people as imperial property, reflecting how completely the system had normalized its own atrocities. The financial machinery extended beyond mere maintenance costs to encompass what palace records euphemistically termed acquisition expenses, the complex network of bribes, payments, and incentives that kept fresh supplies of young men flowing into the imperial collection. Provincial governors received bonuses for identifying suitable candidates. Ship captains earned commissions for transporting human cargo with minimal losses during long voyages. Even village elders could expect rewards for their cooperation in facilitating the disappearance of inconvenient witnesses. But perhaps most disturbing were the development costs. Investments made in boys who showed particular promise for long-term imperial service. These expenditures included advanced education in subjects ranging from classical literature to intimate arts that cannot be described in polite company. Master teachers commanded enormous salaries for their discretion as much as their expertise, understanding that their knowledge of imperial preferences made them simultaneously valuable and dangerous. The palace workshops that created specialized equipment for the harem represented another hidden economy within the broader system. Skilled craftsmen worked behind locked doors, producing items whose purposes were never officially documented, but whose costs appeared in ledgers under deliberately vague categories. These artisans were bound by oaths of secrecy that made their guild membership both lucrative and perilous. Wealthy beyond their dreams, but imprisoned by their knowledge of imperial secrets, The psychological conditioning that transformed mountain boys into imperial playthings required constant reinforcement through a sophisticated system of rewards and punishments that operated below the threshold of official notice. Boys who showed signs of independence found their food reduced in quality and quantity, not enough to cause obvious malnutrition, but sufficient to create constant awareness of their dependence on imperial generosity. Those who demonstrated perfect compliance discovered small luxuries appearing in their quarters, subtle signals that their behavior was being monitored and appreciated. These psychological manipulations were refined through centuries of practice until they achieved an almost scientific precision. The palace administrators maintained detailed profiles of each boy's personality, noting which techniques proved most effective for maintaining control. Some responded well to isolation and deprivation. Others required more subtle approaches involving false hope and manufactured jealousy. The most challenging cases might receive specialized attention from experts whose methods left no physical evidence but created lasting psychological damage. The seasonal rhythms of harem life created natural opportunities for these conditioning programs to intensify. Winter confinement allowed for extended periods of psychological pressure when boys had fewer distractions from their circumstances. The arrival of spring brought new faces and fresh competition that could be used to destabilize established relationships and loyalties. Summer travels exposed the boys to glimpses of freedom that made their return to captivity more psychologically devastating. Autumn ceremonies required peak performance that tested their ability to maintain facades under extreme pressure. Emperor Nicephorus Phocas, who ruled in the mid-10th century, proved particularly innovative in developing what he called loyalty exercises, elaborate psychological games designed to test and strengthen the boys' emotional dependence on imperial approval. These exercises might involve fake escape opportunities that revealed which boys harbored thoughts of freedom, or manufactured crises that tested whether the young men would sacrifice themselves to protect imperial interests. Most cruelly, he created false hopes of eventual liberation that were systematically destroyed to demonstrate the futility of resistance. The Byzantine Empire fell in 1453, but the secrets of its most shameful institutions died centuries earlier, buried beneath layers of official silence and deliberate forgetting. The boys whose stories we've explored tonight, Mikhail and countless others whose names were erased from history, remind us that behind every golden age lies a foundation of suffering that those in power prefer to forget. Their voices echo across 1,000 years, demanding that we remember not just the magnificent art and philosophical achievements of their captors, but the human cost of absolute power unchecked by conscience or law.